This is the part of Jesus' story the church never wanted you to see. You watch him slam his fist into a violent man, women reaching for his body in the shadows, and a demon collapsing under a burst of blinding light. In this video, you're going to uncover 17 suppressed teachings hidden in ancient manuscripts, teachings about justice, desire, and spiritual power that reveal a very different Jesus than the one we were taught. Teachings I never fully understood until I found the fragments scholars said would change everything. But one of these teachings wasn't just erased, it was forbidden for a reason. And the truth behind it might be the most unsettling revelation in all of Christian history. Historians examining the earliest layers of the Jesus tradition frequently encounter a figure far more confrontational than later theological smoothing suggests. In these accounts, Jesus does not withdraw from conflict, nor limit his mission to private morality. Instead, he stands at the intersection of oppression, religious authority, and social vulnerability, acting in ways that challenge the structures of harm within his world. Scholars note that the Roman province of Judea in the early 1st century was an environment saturated with tension, economic strain, heavy taxation, occupation forces, and local elites who mediated imperial expectations. Against that backdrop, the earliest memories of Jesus repeatedly show him stepping into danger rather than away from it, a posture that has led researchers to reconsider the moral dimensions of confrontation in his movement. This is where the first major insight appears in the sources. Jesus' response to injustice was not always passive. Although later Christian tradition heavily emphasized non-violence as absolute principle, several early passages reveal moments where Jesus directly interrupted harm. The cleansing of the temple, preserved in multiple Gospels, is one of the clearest examples. Scholars debate the exact nature of the event, whether it was symbolic protest, prophetic action, or a literal physical disruption, but they agree that Jesus forcibly halted ongoing exploitation carried out under the authority of religious elites. The act targeted economic practices that disadvantaged the poor and enriched temple administrators aligned with Roman power. For historians, this scene complicates attempts to portray Jesus solely as a quiet moral teacher. Instead, it reveals a willingness to confront wrongdoing in ways that disrupted systems, not merely hearts. If that were the extent of the evidence, it might be tempting to assume Jesus' stance was isolated to a single dramatic moment. Yet the second key thread appears consistently across both canonical and non-canonical texts. Jesus condemned hypocrisy within religious leadership more intensely than he criticized the common people who struggled under those leaders' demands. The so-called woes tradition, found mainly in Matthew and Luke, preserves sharp denunciations against certain Pharisaic factions and scribal authorities. Scholars emphasize that these passages should not be read as blanket critiques of Judaism. Instead, they reflect internal debates common within Jewish religious life of the period. Nevertheless, the severity of the language is historically significant. Jesus challenges leaders who manipulated law to secure prestige, created burdens others could not bear, and used piety as performance. This opposition to moralized domination is one of the most historically secure features of his public activity. The confrontation is not random indignation. It emerges as a patterned resistance against religious power used to control rather than liberate. However, a deeper pattern emerges when researchers analyze how Jesus interacts with those who lacked social protection. The third major insight is found here. Jesus' movement consistently prioritized the defense of the vulnerable. Scholars point to a range of episodes where Jesus intervened on behalf of individuals whom society regarded as expendable: women accused of adultery, individuals with chronic illness, the economically marginalized, and children in a culture where adult males controlled lineage and inheritance. These interventions suggest not only compassion, but a functional ethic. Jesus steps into situations where harm is imminent or ongoing. When the woman caught in adultery is brought forward, the narrative, regardless of questions about its later manuscript history, illustrates a tradition in which Jesus dismantles the lethal use of law as a weapon. Historians note that such portrayals align with a broader theme across the synoptic tradition. Jesus reframes the purpose of law around restoration rather than punishment. The significance lies not merely in mercy but in the act of standing between a vulnerable person and an oppressive force. If this were interpreted simply as moral teaching, one might miss the weight of the historical context. Crucially, these actions occur in a society where challenging authority, religious or political, often carried tangible risks. This leads scholars to the fourth insight in this section. Courage within Jesus' movement is not presented as aggression, but as a form of self-giving love. Unlike revolutionary groups of the period that advocated violent resistance to Rome, the Jesus tradition rarely frames bravery in terms of triumph over enemies. Instead, it portrays courage as the willingness to absorb danger for the sake of another, the willingness to approach lepers despite social repercussions, to touch the ritually impure despite legal consequences, and to confront powerful elites despite political risk, forms an ethic that scholars describe as protective rather than militant. This is a distinctive feature. Courage functions not to elevate self, but to shield the threatened. The historical reliability of these themes is strengthened by their coherence across independent textual layers. Scholars note that even sources written with different theological goals preserve the memory of Jesus, confronting oppressive power structures. Mark's Gospel, generally considered the earliest, highlights Jesus' clashes with authorities almost immediately after his ministry begins, suggesting that conflict is not a late interpretive addition, but part of the movement's earliest self-understanding. Cue material reconstructions. Hypothetical shared sayings between Matthew and Luke also contain critiques of hypocrisy and unjust leadership. Meanwhile, later apocryphal texts, though shaped by their own theological motivations, maintain the image of Jesus as one who confronts corruption with piercing clarity. The consistency across traditions gives historians reason to regard these teachings as rooted in plausible historical memory. Even so, the question of how Jesus conceptualized confronting injustice remains a subject of scholarly debate. Some historians argue that his actions modeled a non-violent, direct resistance consistent with prophetic traditions. Others contend that certain scenes, such as the temple incident, indicate a more disruptive force than commonly acknowledged. A minority view suggests the possibility of limited physical confrontation, though this interpretation remains controversial. What most scholars agree on, however, is that Jesus did not advocate passive acceptance of harm. Instead, he embodies a proactive ethical stance, resisting systems that crush the weak, unmasking leaders who exploit religious authority, and stepping directly into harm's path when necessary. In the social world of 1st century Judea, these actions were not merely private virtues, but public challenges. Honor-shame dynamics made confrontation a political statement, legal boundaries made intervention a religious statement, and Roman surveillance made any disruption, however local, a potential threat. Jesus' movement therefore emerges not as an abstract philosophical school, but as a lived resistance to dehumanization. Scholars examining the eventual reaction of authorities, arrest, interrogation, and execution highlight that such outcomes were not accidental. A figure who consistently protected the weak and exposed the powerful inevitably became a target within a system dependent on compliance. At this point, another question begins to form in the margins of the historical record. If Jesus confronted the structures that harmed people externally, what happened when those harms were internal? When the darkness to be confronted was not political or religious, but psychological and spiritual. That tension, emerging from within the tradition itself, opens the pathway to the next domain, where the struggle shifts from outer oppression to the hidden battleground of the human heart. Scholars studying the social world of 1st century Judea frequently note that the earliest portrayals of Jesus place human intimacy at the center of his public activity. Not intimacy in the modern romantic sense, but an embodied relational closeness that broke through rigid purity rules and social hierarchies. In these accounts, Jesus moves through spaces where touch, presence, and shared vulnerability function not as private gestures, but as public statements about human worth. The sources, both canonical and apocryphal, agree on one striking point. His ministry created zones where boundaries collapsed, especially between men and women, the pure and the impure, the included and the excluded. This framework becomes clearer when historians examine the role of women within Jesus' circle. The first major insight emerges here. The evidence for unusually elevated female participation is stronger than once assumed. Although later ecclesiastical structures grew more patriarchal, the earlier layers of the tradition preserve scenes in which women serve as disciples, patrons, witnesses, and recipients of teachings normally reserved for male students. The Gospels consistently record their presence at key moments, accompanying itinerant missions, supporting the movement financially, and standing at the crucifixion when most male followers fled. Apocryphal texts extend this portrayal further. The Gospel of Mary presents Mary Magdalene as a teacher who receives private instruction. The Gospel of Philip refers to her as a close companion, and other second-century texts preserve debates among male disciples about her authority. While the historical accuracy of each apocryphal detail is debated, the pattern across sources suggests that Jesus' earliest circle recognized women as legitimate carriers of his message. Scholars therefore describe this equality not as a later invention, but as a plausible feature of the original movement. From this foundation, a second thread becomes visible. Jesus' interactions with others often relied on physical touch, suggesting a worldview in which the body functioned as a conduit for spiritual encounter. The Gospels contain numerous healing narratives where Jesus reaches out, not from distance, but through direct contact, touching the hand of Peter's mother-in-law, placing fingers in the ears of a man who was deaf, allowing a suffering woman to grasp the fringe of his garment. These gestures appear across independent traditions. Anthropologists analyzing ancient Mediterranean cultures note that such acts were far from neutral. Purity laws, social boundaries, and stigma were embedded in physical contact. Jesus' willingness to cross those boundaries indicates a perception of the body not as a barrier between the sacred and the profane, but as a meeting place where divine compassion flowed outward. Mystic strains of early Christianity, later preserved in works like the Gospel of Philip, interpreted such gestures as evidence of deeper symbolic meaning, the body as vessel, the senses as pathways, and closeness as necessary for transformation. Whether Jesus himself framed touch in explicitly mystical terms remains debated, but the sources are clear that physical proximity played a central role in his public acts. A third strand surfaces when examining whom Jesus chose to touch and allow to touch him. The pattern is not incidental. It consistently involves people labeled impure, unclean, or socially marginal, lepers, women with chronic bleeding, the physically disabled, the mentally distressed, and those living outside established social respectability. Historians emphasize that in first-century Judaism, purity laws were not simply personal preferences. They shaped social participation, ritual access, and communal boundaries. Contact with certain individuals created impurity that required ritual cleansing. Yet the Jesus tradition reverses this logic. Impurity does not flow into him. Healing flows outward. In multiple scenes, Jesus approaches the marginalized without hesitation, even when their condition was believed to be contagious, disgraceful, or spiritually tainted. Scholars often highlight the story of the bleeding woman, whose illness created a permanent state of ritual exclusion. When she reaches for Jesus, the narrative portrays not contamination but restoration. This dynamic suggests that Jesus viewed dignity as inherent, not assigned by law or status. His movement therefore becomes a space where those excluded from normal communal life find renewed social and spiritual belonging. These encounters illuminate a fourth key insight, one that appears subtly across several early texts. Certain teachings are transmitted only in moments of close relational nearness. The canonical Gospels hint at this pattern when they describe private explanations of parables given only to a smaller group of followers. Apocryphal texts make this dynamic explicit. The Gospel of Mary presents a scene where Mary receives instruction that others do not understand. The Gospel of Thomas contains sayings about inner discovery that presume quiet personal reception rather than public proclamation. While historians treat these texts with caution, recognizing their late composition, they reflect a memory within early Christian communities that some teachings were delivered not in the open crowds, but in intimate settings, where trust, presence, and vulnerability allowed deeper meaning to emerge. Even in the canonical tradition, the Transfiguration account, private healings, and late-night conversations suggest a pattern in which meaningful insight arises in proximity rather than spectacle. This emphasis on intimacy also reshapes how scholars understand the social structure of Jesus' movement. Unlike formal philosophical schools, his circle did not revolve around academic disputation or hierarchical learning. Instead, the group functioned more like a kinship network, constructed not through blood but through shared experience. Meals, travel, touch, and conversation created a sense of belonging that transcended typical boundaries within Jewish village life. Sociologists studying new religious movements note that such interpersonal dynamics often form the backbone of social transformation. In Jesus' case, intimacy appears not as an incidental feature, but as an organizing principle. Individuals marginalized by purity codes, women, the sick, the poor, become central participants, not peripheral recipients. This inversion of status norms challenges assumptions about early Christian origins and underscores why later institutional structures sometimes downplayed these aspects. The historical implications of these traditions extend into later centuries. As Christianity expanded into the Greco-Roman world, new converts brought philosophical influences that increasingly spiritualized Jesus' teachings and limited the role of physicality in religious practice. Simultaneously, developing ecclesiastical hierarchies prioritized male leadership, reducing the visibility of women's contributions preserved in earlier texts. This shift helps explain why some teachings rooted in embodied closeness or radical equality appear in apocryphal works rather than official canon. These later compositions, though historically layered, testify to communities attempting to preserve memories of intimacy and relational depth that no longer fully aligned with dominant structures of authority. Modern scholars therefore treat these themes not as fringe ideas, but as essential clues to the original texture of Jesus' practice. The movement's early emphasis on equality and embodied dignity becomes especially visible when contrasted with surrounding social norms. Roman household codes placed men at the top of domestic hierarchies. Purity laws created spatial separation between the clean and the unclean, and cultural ideals valued honor over vulnerability. Against this background, Jesus' pattern of open-table fellowship, touch without fear, and instruction shared with women represents a dramatic ethical reorientation. These actions, more than doctrinal statements, reveal the lived expression of his message. When these four strands, equality, embodied spirituality, restored dignity, and intimate transmission, are woven together, the resulting portrait departs from later institutional representations. Jesus emerges as a teacher whose message is enacted through presence rather than decree, whose authority is relational rather than structural, and whose movement carries within it a fundamentally inclusive vision. This emphasis on nearness creates the conditions for understanding the next phase in the tradition, where the arena of struggle shifts once again. For if Jesus' intimacy dissolves social barriers, the texts soon reveal that a deeper conflict arises from within the human condition itself, a confrontation not with society's boundaries, but with the shadows that inhabit the inner life. Scholars tracing the layers of early Christian memory frequently observe a shift that occurs within the tradition once the focus moves from social boundaries to the terrain of the inner life. If the earlier portrayals emphasize Jesus confronting external forms of oppression, corrupt power, exclusion, and the misuse of religious authority, another stream of sources highlights a different struggle. This second battleground is not public but interior, not institutional but psychological and spiritual. It appears in scenes of exorcism, in teachings about truth and deception, and in sayings that speak of identity in terms of hidden sacred naming. In this domain, Jesus is depicted not simply as teacher or healer, but as one who exposes illusions that fracture the human person from within. Historians often begin with the observation that first-century Judea held a complex understanding of demons, spirits, and moral agency. Popular ideas about possession circulated widely, but these beliefs were intertwined with psychological, social, and symbolic meanings. Anthropologists studying ancient Mediterranean cultures consistently warn against reading these accounts merely as supernatural descriptions. They functioned as narratives that expressed internal turmoil in the language of shared cultural imagination. Within this framework, Jesus' interactions with individuals, described as possessed, reflect something far deeper than confrontation with external malevolent beings. Scholars examining the earliest gospel layers see in these stories a portrayal of Jesus addressing the fractured interior worlds of those who felt torn by fear, shame, or disintegration. The exorcism accounts therefore become windows into how early communities understood inner conflict. This is where the first major thread of this section becomes visible. In contrast to political rebels of his period, Jesus does not direct his energy toward identifying human enemies or assigning blame to external groups. Instead, he emphasizes the internal divides that prevent individuals from living in truth. The strongman metaphor in the Synoptic tradition, for example, functions less as a literal demonology and more as a symbolic exploration of how destructive forces occupy the inner self. Modern scholars who analyze the narrative structures note that the focus is not on elaborate descriptions of demons, but on the result of their influence: fragmentation, silence, self-harm, and isolation. These accounts portray Jesus as one who restores coherence where inner division has taken hold. The miracles, regardless of one's interpretation of their literal or symbolic nature, preserve memories of a figure who brought order to lives dominated by fear. As these narratives unfold, another pattern emerges. The confrontation between light and deception is treated as central to Jesus' message. The sources emphasize truth not as abstract doctrine, but as a force that unmasks falsehood. In the Gospel of John, the contrast between light and darkness becomes a defining theme. In the Synoptics, teachings about inner vision, clarity, and sincerity point toward a similar conceptual center. Historians observing these parallels argue that Jesus' movement framed truth-telling as a disruptive act. Illusions, whether social, moral, or spiritual, interfered with a person's capacity to recognize reality. The early community seems to have understood deception not merely as lying, but as self-deception, the mind's tendency to distort what it fears to face. Thus, when Jesus casts out darkness, the act symbolizes more than a supernatural encounter. It represents the moment when hidden motivations, secrets, and internal contradictions are brought to light. In multiple accounts, the presence of Jesus triggers such exposure. Individuals confess, collapse, or cry out when meeting him, suggesting that the tradition remembered him as one whose clarity forced internal conflict into the open. Scholars studying narrative psychology point out that this phenomenon, truth-provoking and emotional unmasking, appears across cultures in figures remembered as moral reformers or spiritual healers. The Jesus tradition fits this pattern with remarkable consistency. Light, in these texts, is not comfortable illumination. It is the force that dissolves illusions that protect long-held fears. Within this conceptual world, a different set of sayings becomes significant, particularly those surrounding the phrase, "I am." In the Gospel of John, Jesus repeatedly uses "I am" language, echoing divine self-identification from the Hebrew Scriptures. Historians note that this language appears in a highly theological context and should not be assumed to reflect direct historical speech. Yet the theme it represents, identity rooted in sacred naming, resonates with broader currents in early Jewish mysticism. These traditions taught that a true name reveals the deepest reality of a being, that naming confers authority, and that misnaming leads to spiritual disorientation. Within this framework, the Jesus tradition's emphasis on "I am" statements reflects an understanding of identity grounded not in social status, but in alignment with divine truth. The third key thread of this section emerges here. Early Christians appear to have believed that clarity of identity had transformative power. Knowing who one truly is, before fear, before illusion, before social labeling, functions as a kind of internal exorcism. The Apocryphon of John, a 2nd century mystical text, amplifies this idea by portraying salvation as recognition of one's true origin and name. While historians do not treat such works as direct records of Jesus' teaching, they illustrate how early communities interpreted his emphasis on inner truth. Self-knowledge becomes an act of liberation, driving out confusion, just as exorcism drives out oppressive spirits. The Synoptic Gospels contain echoes of this concept in simpler form. In one account, Jesus asks a tormented man for the name of the force that oppresses him, and the act of naming begins the process of liberation. Scholars reading this symbolically argue that the tradition preserves a psychological insight. Clarity begins when the forces shaping one's life are named honestly. This interplay between naming, identity, and freedom underlies the third conceptual strand of this section, the power of sacred naming as a way of confronting darkness. The interplay of these themes, inner conflict, truth as light, and identity expressed through naming, creates a coherent picture of how the earliest communities understood the struggle against darkness. Rather than imagining demons as creatures that lurked in caves or shadows, these texts consistently portray the battleground as internal. The kingdom divided against itself metaphor, often cited in discussions of Jesus' teachings, reinforces this view. Historians observe that in Jewish wisdom literature, internal division was a common metaphor for moral failure. The Jesus tradition builds upon this imagery, presenting a worldview in which inner fragmentation is the root of destructive behavior. This approach differentiates Jesus' movement from other contemporary groups. Apocalyptic sects often located evil primarily in external forces, corrupt rulers, demonic armies, or cosmic adversaries. Jesus, by contrast, appears to situate the decisive battle within the human heart. Scholars note that even when he speaks of Satan, the figure acts less as a mythological opponent and more as a symbol of temptation, self-deception, and moral collapse. This framing makes his teachings remarkably adaptable across cultural contexts, allowing later communities to expand, reinterpret, or spiritualize the struggle without severing its original meaning. The implications of this interior framing become more apparent when placed alongside the emphasis on intimacy seen earlier. If human closeness restores dignity and belonging, inner clarity restores coherence and agency. The movement therefore addresses both the external and internal dimensions of human suffering, the harm inflicted by social structures and the harm generated by inner distortion. This holistic approach explains why later mystical traditions, both canonical and apocryphal, gravitated toward Jesus' sayings about light, identity, and truth. The image of a teacher who brings wholeness to fractured lives resonated deeply with communities seeking refuge from both external conflict and internal turmoil. As historians transition from these accounts toward the next group of teachings, one theme becomes impossible to ignore. If Jesus' movement grappled with both the outer structures of injustice and the inner fractures of the self, a third layer emerges in texts that later institutions suppressed or ignored, teachings that redefine salvation, the kingdom, and divine presence in ways that challenged developing ecclesiastical authority. The move from confronting inner darkness to unveiling hidden spiritual realities marks the next stage in this unfolding narrative. Historians examining the development of early Christianity frequently observe a striking divide between the teachings remembered in the canonical Gospels and those preserved in texts that later communities deemed unacceptable. This divide did not emerge overnight. During the first 2 centuries of the movement, Christian identity remained fluid, diverse, and often contested. Different communities emphasized different memories of Jesus. Some highlighted public preaching, others mystical insight, others ethical practice, and still others secret instruction given to select disciples. When this diversity was later reduced into a single orthodox narrative, many voices were pushed to the margins. what survived in apocryphal and Gnostic writings, offers a glimpse into theological worlds that once competed for legitimacy. These texts do not provide direct transcripts of Jesus' words, yet they preserve echoes of early debates about the nature of the kingdom, the meaning of salvation, and the location of divine presence. One theme that recurs across several of these suppressed traditions is the claim that the kingdom of God exists not as a distant future realm, but as an inner reality. Scholars studying the Gospel of Thomas, a 2nd century collection of sayings attributed to Jesus, highlight its repeated insistence that the kingdom is already present within and among human beings. This is not mere poetic language, it represents a fundamentally different understanding of divine action. Instead of envisioning salvation as dependent on external institutions, rituals, or intermediaries, these texts assert that divine presence emerges through self-knowledge and awakened perception. The saying, often paraphrased as "the kingdom is within you and around you," illustrates this worldview. Historians debate whether this reflects teachings from the historical Jesus or later spiritual interpretation. Yet they agree that the saying preserves an early Christian attempt to locate sacred reality in the depths of human interiority. For communities shaped by this perspective, salvation becomes a process of recognition rather than rescue. This inward emphasis leads naturally into a second thread that marks these alternative traditions. If the kingdom exists within, then seeking God primarily through external structures becomes unnecessary. The Gospel of Mary preserves one of the clearest articulations of this idea. In it, Mary Magdalene recounts teachings she says Jesus gave privately about the soul's ascent, self-mastery, and freedom from fear. When male disciples challenge her authority, the text portrays her as offering insight not based on hierarchical privilege, but on inner comprehension. Scholars note that although this gospel is late and reflects its own theological worldview, it reveals an early Christian conviction that divine truth could be accessed directly through the inner self, not through institutional mediation. The polemic embedded in the narrative suggests that debates over authority were already intense in the 2nd century, and communities preserving this text resisted efforts to centralize power around emerging clergy. This view also appears in the Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus is depicted as challenging the assumption that divine reality resides in physical locations, such as mountains, deserts, or temples. Instead, these texts assert that the living divine is found where authentic perception occurs. Scholars analyzing these sayings note that they resonate with certain strands of Jewish wisdom literature, where divine understanding is linked to inward discernment rather than ritual performance. Yet the apocryphal texts push this idea further. They imply that institutions claiming exclusive access to God misunderstand the very nature of the divine. In these traditions, the sacred is not mediated, but immediate, not imposed, but discovered. This reorientation would naturally place such teachings at odds with communities seeking to define doctrine, establish hierarchy, and build ecclesiastical structure. These tensions deepen when researchers examine how Gnostic communities defined salvation. Unlike later Orthodox theology, which framed salvation in terms of forgiveness, atonement, and divine grace, Gnostic writings emphasize knowledge, gnosis, as the path to liberation. This knowledge is not intellectual accumulation, but experiential recognition of one's true origin and nature. According to texts like the Apocryphon of John and the Trimorphic Protonoia, human beings contain a spark of divine reality obscured by ignorance, fear, and the material conditions of existence. Salvation occurs when this inner spark awakens through knowledge of its source. Jesus, in these texts, functions not primarily as sacrificial figure, but as revealer, one who removes illusions and restores memory. Historians emphasize that such writings emerged in the 2nd century, shaped by syncretic influences from Judaism, Platonism, and Near Eastern mysticism, yet they testify to an early Christian quest for meaning that differed profoundly from the frameworks that later became orthodox. One of the most intriguing aspects of these suppressed teachings is how they reinterpret the role of law, ritual, and institutional authority. If divine presence is internal, and salvation arises through knowledge, then religious institutions lose their exclusive claim. Authority shifts from external structures to inner awakening. This dynamic may help explain why such texts were marginalized as the Church sought unity and doctrinal coherence. As episcopal leadership grew more centralized, in the late 2nd and 3rd centuries, writings that portrayed direct access to divine wisdom through personal insight posed a challenge to emerging ecclesiastical stability. Historians examining the correspondence of early bishops, such as Irenaeus of Lyon, note how strongly they argued against groups that claimed hidden or secret teachings. From their perspective, such claims threatened to fragment the movement. From the perspective of the communities preserving these works, institutional consolidation threatened the diversity of early Christian spiritual experience. The interplay between these competing visions becomes particularly evident in the evolving portrayal of figures like Mary Magdalene. In canonical texts, she appears as witness, follower, and recipient of healing. In apocryphal texts, she emerges as interpreter, visionary, and trusted confidante. Scholars do not attempt to merge these portrayals into a single historical profile. Instead, they treat them as evidence of different theological landscapes. The prominence given to Mary in texts like the Gospel of Mary and the Dialogue of the Saviour reflects communities that valued the inner, contemplative dimensions of Jesus' message. Her conflict with male disciples in these narratives signals tensions between charismatic insight and institutional authority, tensions still unresolved when these texts were composed. The significance of these suppressed teachings extends beyond the content of specific sayings. They represent an alternative trajectory within early Christianity, one that centered interiority, personal transformation, and experiential knowledge. The emphasis on inner kingdom, direct encounter with the divine, and salvation through recognition reveals a spirituality that framed faith as awakening rather than adherence. While later tradition moved towards sacramental, doctrinal, and hierarchical forms of communal life, these suppressed writings preserved another possibility, a version of Christianity grounded in inward exploration, egalitarian access to wisdom, and liberation through understanding. As historians move from these spiritual teachings toward the final group of themes, the trajectory becomes unmistakable. If Jesus was remembered as revealing the kingdom within and encouraging direct access to divine truth, some communities extended this vision into a fully developed cosmology. These cosmological systems attempted to explain not only the nature of human identity, but the structure of the universe, the journey of the soul, and the hidden unity binding all existence. The transition from inner awakening to cosmic interpretation marks the next stage in the tradition's evolution. Historians mapping the landscape of early Christian diversity often observe that some communities did not stop at redefining the kingdom or the nature of salvation. Instead, they expanded their reflections into full cosmological systems, attempting to explain the origins of the universe, the structure of human existence, and the destiny of the soul. These systems, found mainly in Gnostic and apocryphal writings from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, were eventually rejected by emerging Orthodox leadership. Yet their existence reveals an intellectual and spiritual ambition that shaped significant portions of early Christian imagination. In these texts, Jesus is not merely teacher, healer, or revealer. He becomes the interpreter of cosmic architecture, a guide through layered worlds and hidden realities. One of the most prominent features of these systems is the division of human existence into multiple levels, commonly expressed as body, soul, and spirit. Scholars analyzing Valentinian Christianity, one of the most influential Gnostic movements, note that this tripartite anthropology sought to explain why individuals experience reality in such different ways. According to these traditions, the body anchors the human being in material existence, the soul mediates perception, emotion, and moral struggle, and the spirit, also called the inner spark, or seed, links the person to divine origin. This structure appears not only in Valentinian texts, but in other writings associated with 2nd century Christian mysticism. The layering does not imply contempt for the physical world, though some groups adopted ascetic interpretations. Rather, it attempts to articulate the complexity of human life and the multiple dimensions in which transformation occurs. For communities shaped by this worldview, Jesus' role involved awakening the spirit so that the soul could disentangle itself from patterns shaped by the body's limitations and the world's illusions. In the broader context of ancient Mediterranean thought, a tripartite structure was not unusual. Greek philosophical traditions, especially Platonism, offered several influential models, dividing the human person into rational, spirited, and appetitive components. Jewish apocalyptic literature outlined distinctions between earthly life, heavenly realms, and the divine throne room. Early Christian groups, drawing from these intellectual currents, sought to unify them around the figure of Jesus, interpreting his teachings as keys to understanding the layered nature of existence. This synthesis produced cosmologies in which salvation required harmonizing the different aspects of the self, aligning the spirit with its divine source, and purifying the soul from the distortions accumulated through material life. Scholars examining these texts emphasize that, while speculative, they reflect sincere attempts by early communities to articulate a coherent vision of human existence in a complex and turbulent world. The second prominent theme in these cosmological traditions concerns the journey of the soul before birth and after death. While canonical texts provide limited detail on such matters, apocryphal works offer elaborate narratives mapping the soul's origins, trials, and ultimate destination. The Pistis Sophia, a 3rd century text associated with Egyptian Christian mysticism, describes the soul's ascent through a series of realms, each governed by divine or semi-divine beings who test, challenge, or reveal knowledge. The Apocryphon of John presents an origin story in which human souls originate from a higher divine realm and descend into material existence, temporarily forgetting their true nature. Salvation in these systems involves remembering, ascending, and rejoining the realm from which the soul emerged. Historians studying these writings often approach them with caution, recognizing their complexity and their distance from the earliest layers of Christian memory. Yet they acknowledge that such stories represent a significant strand of early Christian reflection. These texts emerged in communities grappling with persecution, instability, and existential uncertainty. In such context, detailed accounts of the soul's journey offered meaning and reassurance. They framed suffering as temporary, moral struggle as a stage in cosmic development, and death as transition rather than annihilation. The emphasis on ascent, recognition, and reunion also aligns with broader ancient Mediterranean concerns about the afterlife, where philosophical, Jewish, and mystery cult traditions all speculated about the soul's fate. The Christian adaptations of these ideas integrated Jesus into the role of guide, revealer, and liberator, one who provides the knowledge necessary for the soul to navigate these realms. The focus on the soul's origin and destiny leads naturally into the third conceptual thread that characterizes these forbidden cosmologies, the claim that all existence is held together by a hidden unity. This idea appears across several early Christian mystical texts, including the Gospel of Philip and various Hermetic writings that circulated in the same period. In these works, the universe is not composed of isolated parts, but is woven together by an underlying correspondence between the divine and the material. Opposites, light and darkness, male and female, visible and invisible, are described as complementary aspects of a deeper whole. Scholars examining these traditions emphasize that this unity is not pantheism in the strict sense. Instead, it reflects a worldview in which the divine emanates through all levels of reality, creating harmony when properly recognized and distortion when forgotten. This concept of unity often takes the form of symbolic language. Texts describe pairs, syzygies, mirrors, or reflections as ways of expressing the interconnectedness of all things. In Valentinian thought, for example, creation unfolds through a series of emanations that maintain their link to the divine source, even when some become fragmented or fall into ignorance. Human beings, as microcosms of the larger structure, contain within themselves the same patterns found in the cosmos. Understanding the self therefore becomes a pathway to understanding the universe. Scholars note that while these ideas diverge from later Orthodox theology, they reflect genuine attempts by early Christians to integrate their faith into broader philosophical and mystical frameworks that dominated the intellectual landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. The historical significance of these cosmological systems becomes clearer when examining why they were eventually suppressed. As the Christian movement expanded and sought institutional coherence, leaders such as Irenaeus, Tertullian, and later Augustine argued that speculation about cosmic structure threatened doctrinal unity. They feared that such elaborate cosmologies, often revealed through secret teaching or mystical insight, would fragment communities and undermine the authority of emerging ecclesiastical leadership. In response, these leaders emphasized simpler creedal statements, a unified canon of scripture, and a shared liturgical structure. Over time, cosmological writings fell outside the accepted boundaries of orthodoxy, surviving only in hidden communities or buried manuscripts. Despite this suppression, modern scholarship has reclaimed these texts as essential witnesses to early Christian diversity. They demonstrate that the movement's intellectual range was far broader than previously assumed. The tripartite understanding of the self, the soul's cosmic journey, and the vision of universal unity reflect attempts to situate Jesus' message within an expansive metaphysical framework. While these ideas did not prevail in the formation of classical Christian doctrine, they left lasting traces in mystical traditions, monastic spirituality, and later esoteric Christian movements. Seen in this light, the forbidden cosmologies preserved in apocryphal writings provide the final layer of the tradition's early development. Together with the teachings about action, intimacy, inner truth, and suppressed spiritual insight, they reveal a movement wrestling with the deepest questions of human existence. These cosmological systems represent an effort to understand not only how people live and change, but how the universe itself is structured and how human identity fits within that structure. They complete the arc that began with the historical figure of Jesus walking among the oppressed of first-century Judea and extend into a cosmic vision that sought to explain everything from human suffering to the origins of the world.